The city surgeon called her just a country nurse, a woman who ran the front of a 6-bed hospital at the top of a snowbound valley and handed out warm blankets to people waiting out the cold, and he laughed at the worn brass compass she kept clipped to her lanyard, and not one person in that little building knew that the quiet woman they had decided was a relic had once flown the dying out of the worst places on earth strapped into the back of a screaming aircraft, and that before the night was over, she would be the only person still moving who could keep their patients from dying on the floor of their own emergency room. Her name was Ruth Calloway, and most of the staff called her Ruthie, and the visiting surgeon, the one who had been stranded by the storm and had decided within an hour of arriving that a charge nurse in her early 40s at a mountain hospital was a quaint local fixture and not a colleague, did not really call her anything at all, because to him she was part of the building, as ordinary as the rows of empty chairs in the waiting room, or the soft hum of the heaters along the wall, or the snow piling up against the tall glass doors. She was 41 years old. She had been a nurse for 19 of those years, the last 6 at this small critical access hospital perched at the head of a high valley where the nearest real trauma center was 90 minutes down a single mountain road in good weather and a different planet entirely in bad, working the long winter evenings because the winter was hers and the work was honest and nobody had the energy to tell her how to do a job she had been doing since before half of them had finished their training. She moved through the little hospital the way deep water moves, slow and certain and easy to underestimate, and on the night everything changed, she was exactly where she always was at the start of a shift, at the small front desk under the bright ceiling lights, clipping a worn brass and leather wrist compass to the faded canvas band on her lanyard before she opened the board. The compass was old. The brass had gone soft and warm at the edges from years of being held, and clipped beside it on the same loop was a small dull coin, plain metal worn smooth, the kind of thing a person is given and does not buy, though none of the visiting staff had ever looked closely enough to wonder what it was. She checked it the way some people check a wedding ring when they are bracing for a long day, a glance at the needle that always swung the same true way no matter how lost everything else got, and then she snapped the lanyard straight and squared her shoulders and went to look at her board. Dr. Marcus Hale was 52 years old and one of the best trauma surgeons in the city 3 hours to the south, and he had not meant to be at the top of this valley at all. He had been driving back from a conference, taking the high road because the maps had promised it was faster, and the storm had come down off the ridge faster than any forecast had called, and the highway authority had closed the long tunnel and the pass behind it, and he had crept the last few miles into the little mountain town with his knuckles white on the wheel and his expensive car fishtailing on snow it had never been built for, and had ended up, of all places, at the only lit building still open, which was the hospital. He could have sat in the waiting room. Instead, because he was who he was, he had introduced himself with his full title and a tight professional smile, and spent the first hour pacing the small ward with the restless contempt of a thoroughbred penned in a paddock, looking at the 6 beds and the single old imaging machine and the paper charts and the quiet country nurse running the front of it, and filed all of it under the same heading, which was beneath him. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was something more ordinary and more dangerous. A brilliant man who had spent 25 years being the most important person in every operating room he entered, and had come to believe that the size of the building was the same thing as the size of the people in it, and that a nurse at a 6-bed hospital was, by simple arithmetic, a nurse who had not been good enough to work anywhere that mattered. He looked at a country charge nurse writing in pen under a fluorescent light with a battered brass compass on a frayed cord around her neck, and he saw a person playing at medicine in a place where medicine barely happened, and he felt, in the easy, weightless way you feel it about someone you have never once imagined being, a flicker of contempt dressed up as professional concern. You know they make these now that fit on a watch or just on the phone in your pocket, he said to her, an hour into the storm, with a smile that was almost kind, nodding at the brass compass on her chest. You don't need to carry your little hiking trinket around an emergency room, sweetheart. You're not going to get lost between here and the supply closet. And Ruth had looked down at the small brass thing on her lanyard and then back up at him, and she had said, I know, and nothing else, and gone back to her board, and he had taken her silence for the surrender of a woman who had no answer, when in fact it was the silence of a woman who had a great many answers and had simply learned across 19 years that the people who needed to tell her she was out of her depth were almost never the people who would listen if she told them why she was not. So she let it stand. She let nearly all of it stand. That was the thing about Ruth Calloway that one night would teach them all at once. She did not need them to see her. She needed her patients warm and sorted and breathing, and her hands steady, and the compass on her chest, though she could not always have told you why she still carried it after all these years, only that the day she stopped would be the day she would need it. If you have ever watched someone good get treated like they were nothing and felt that quiet anger that has nowhere to go, then you already understand why I tell these stories, and you already belong on this channel. Take 1 second to subscribe, because Unspoken Valor exists for exactly that feeling and exactly these people, the ones the room writes off, the ones who turn out to be the only thing holding the room up when it starts to fall. The folks who do are the ones who stay for the part where the world finally finds out who it has been ignoring, and that part is coming, and I do not want you to miss it. Because what happened in that little mountain hospital before the night was through is the kind of thing that, if you had been standing at that front desk, you would never have looked at a quiet country nurse the same way again. There were 2 younger members of staff who took their cue from the surgeon the moment he arrived, the way people always defer to the loudest credential in the room, a confident young physician assistant named Cole and a brisk, quick young aide named Priya, both in their late 20s, both bright and capable, both good people who had simply been taught by the whole shape of their training to trust the title over the person and the protocol over the quiet woman who could not quote them the year a guideline had changed. They were not bad. That is the part that matters, that the people who fell in behind the surgeon and looked at Ruth Calloway with new doubt were not villains. They were just impressionable, in the specific way that smart young people are when a famous expert walks into their small world and tells them, without quite saying it, that everything they had taken for granted was provincial. On most nights, on an ordinary winter evening where the patients came in 1 or 2 at a time and the problems arrived tidy and slow, none of it cost anything at all. The ward ran. The heaters hummed their steady hum. The country nurse handled the front and was easy to defer past, and everyone was comfortable inside the arrangement, and nobody ever once imagined 100 broken and burning people coming through those doors in a single hour. There was a third figure in the small theater of Ruth's working life that night, and he was not even in the building, which somehow made him worse, because a man who can belittle you from 300 miles away through a telephone is a man with a long reach. His name was Garrett Voss, and he was 48, and his title was something long and modern that came down, in the end, to numbers. He ran the region's small network of rural hospitals from an office in the city, had never once set foot in this one in the dead of winter, and moved through his work like a man reading a balance sheet that happened to be made of people. He had heard about the charge nurse at the mountain hospital who ran her own surge drills in the empty ambulance bay at the slow hour of the shift, who had once asked, on a regional call, whether anyone had a real mass casualty plan for the valley if the tunnel ever came down in the snow, and who had been told, with a small laugh, that this was a 6-bed critical access hospital, not a field hospital, and that she should focus on her core metrics. Garrett Voss did not find it charming. He found it a liability, because a nurse doing unscripted things in one of his buildings was a variable he could not put in a column, and the columns were the whole of his religion. So he had begun, quietly, to build a file. He had the drills noted as unauthorized use of clinical space, the longhand cards as a documentation inconsistency, the compass, in an email, as personal equipment not approved by the supply committee, a phrase he was rather proud of, and he had scheduled a formal conversation for the following week. And that very evening, when the surgeon called the regional line to complain that he was stranded in a building run by a nurse who carried a compass and wrote in pen, Garrett Voss had listened with growing satisfaction, because here was a credentialed physician confirming everything his file already said. The write-up itself had come the week before, a printed sheet that the nervous junior administrator drove up the mountain to hand her in person because Garrett Voss believed in a paper trail. It was a formal counseling notice, the first of her career, and it cited the drills and the cards and the trinket, and at the bottom there was a line for her to sign acknowledging that she understood. She set the paper down. She reached up, without quite deciding to, and her thumb found the small worn coin clipped beside the compass on her lanyard, and she turned it over once, the way she always did when something was about to make a mistake. And the narration of her own life went very quiet in her chest. That coin was older than Garrett Voss's entire career in health administration. It had been pressed into her palm on a flight line at the end of the worst week of her life by a man with 3 days of beard and other people's blood dried brown to his elbows, who had told her to keep it because people who do what she had just done do not get parades. They get to go home, and the coin is, so you remember the ones who did not. The compass had come from the same man, and she did not say any of that. She looked at the junior administrator's apologetic face and picked up the pen and signed the paper, because she had learned a long time ago that you do not waste your strength arguing with a system that is sure, and you save it for the night the system finds out whether you were right. What none of them knew, what was written in no file in this hospital or in Garrett Voss's office or anywhere a credential committee would ever look, was where Ruth Calloway had spent the 11 years before she had ever clocked in at a small mountain hospital. She had worn a different uniform and answered to a call sign instead of a name, and she had been a combat aeromedical evacuation nurse, which meant her ward had been the rattling cargo bay of an aircraft, and her patients had been the most broken people the worst places on earth could produce, loaded onto her litters still bleeding, still burning, still fighting for breath, and handed into her care with the simple, terrible instruction to keep them alive until the wheels touched down somewhere with a surgeon. She had learned up there the thing that no classroom can teach and no protocol can hold, which is how to practice medicine in motion, in the cold and the dark and the noise, with no power and no imaging and no surgeon and more dying than there were hands. How to look at a cabin full of the catastrophically wounded and feel the panic rise in her own throat and set it down, deliberately, like a tool she could not use right now, and start sorting. She had learned that in a true mass casualty load, the most dangerous instinct a clinician has is the urge to pour everything into the first person they see. because the first person they see is rarely the one who will die in the next 10 minutes, and the whole grim art of it is to move past the loud to reach the silent. She had buried friends who never learned to move past the loud. And then, for reasons she kept folded up small and did not take out at work, she had come down off the long deployments and the longer flights and traded the call sign for a name tag and taken the quietest, honest job she could find at the head of a snowbound valley and let everyone assume she had never done anything harder than hand out cough drops and blankets. There was one person in the building who suspected there was more to her, and his name was Sam, the night aide, a warm, round-faced man in his 30s with an instinct for reading people that no one had ever put on his evaluation. Sam had worked beside Ruth for 4 winters, and in 4 winters he had watched 100 small things the visiting doctors never noticed. He had watched her eyes go flat and calm in exactly the moments other people's went wide, watched her voice drop lower and slower when a case turned bad instead of climbing the way panic climbs, watched her hands stay perfectly still over a crashing patient while a brand new traveling nurse's shook. He had watched her glance at the ceiling and the oxygen shutoffs and the exits in any new room, once automatically the way some people check for the nearest coffee. He had watched her step off distances in the empty ambulance bay on slow nights, her lips moving, mapping where she would put litters if the whole drive ever filled at once. And he had never once asked her why, because you did not ask Ruth things, you simply noticed that the answers were there, behind the quiet, and that they were not the answers a normal Ursum would explain. Once, a cocky traveling nurse had rolled his eyes at Ruth's longhand cards and her compass and muttered something about the burned-out small-town lifer, and Sam had taken him aside, very calmly, and told him to leave her be, that the day was coming when he would want to be standing exactly where Ruth Calloway was standing, and he had better hope she still bothered to teach him anything by then. The traveling nurse had laughed it off. Sam had not been joking. The night it happened began like any other, which is the way these nights always begin. It was a Tuesday in the deep of winter, and the storm had been building all afternoon, the kind of high country blizzard the old-timers in the valley could smell coming, and by early evening the snow was falling so thick and sideways that the streetlights down the main road were just smeared halos, and the world beyond the hospital windows had gone to a roaring white nothing. The little emergency room had its ordinary slow catalog of winter trouble. An older man with a cough that had gone down into his chest. A woman who had slipped on her icy porch steps and done something to her wrist. A young ranch hand with a bad cut across his palm from a frozen latch. A feverish college student. A long-haul trucker who had pulled off the closed pass with chest pain he had been ignoring since the state line. Ruth worked the front of it the way she always did, calm and unhurried and unremarkable to anyone watching. Calling them up one at a time, laying 2 fingers on a wrist while she asked the questions, reading 100 small signals the form did not ask for, the color of a lip, the set of a jaw, the particular way a person holds the part of them that is most wrong. She moved the talkative ones to the warm chairs and the quiet gray ones to the back, and twice that evening she moved someone faster than their numbers said she should have, on nothing she could have written down, and twice that evening she was right. The second time, it was the long-haul trucker with the chest pain. The triage screen had him as a low priority, walked in on his own, stable enough vitals, a routine recheck, and Cole, eager to look decisive in front of the famous surgeon, had already waved him toward a chair to wait. Ruth looked at him for the length of one breath and saw something the screen did not see, a faint grayness at the edges of him, a stillness in the way he sat that was not calm, but the opposite of calm, the body going quiet the way a body goes quiet when it is busy with something serious underneath. She did not announce it. She simply walked him back herself into a bay and put him on a monitor, and a few minutes later the something underneath announced itself in a way no one could miss, a rhythm sliding sideways toward the edge of a cliff, and because she had moved him when she did, there was a team and a crash cart standing around him when it happened, instead of an aide finding him slumped over in a chair an hour later. Hale arrived in the middle of it, took over with brisk competence, did good work, real work, stabilized the man and got the rhythm back where it belonged, and afterward, when it was done and the trucker was alive and resting, Hale looked at the chart and frowned and said, to no one in particular, that triage had over-prioritized a borderline patient and tied up a bay on a busy night. Sam opened his mouth. Ruth caught his eye across the bay and gave the smallest shake of her head, and Sam closed his mouth and the moment passed, and Hale walked away certain he had just watched his own skill save a life, which in part he had, never once wondering whose judgment had put the man in front of him alive enough to save. That was how it went, the whole long, slow education the building refused to receive. Ruth would see the thing first and move, and someone with letters after their name would arrive in time to finish what her seeing had started and take the win and file her foresight under provincial fussiness. She did not need the win. She had learned, in the years she did not talk about, exactly how little the credit was worth and exactly how much the work was worth, because she had done the work in places where there was no credit to be had, where you kept alive who you could keep alive and carried the rest in you forever, and no one ever wrote your name down at all. A 6-bed hospital in a quiet valley on a snowy Tuesday was, by comparison, a gentle place. She was grateful for the gentleness. She had earned a little gentleness. She had no way of knowing that the gentleness had exactly 2 hours and 40 minutes left to run. Around 7 in the evening, the storm went from bad to something with a different name. Cole and Priya were running the back of the little ward with the bright, tireless confidence of people who have a famous surgeon to impress, and Hale had settled into a chair near the nurse's station with a cup of coffee and the air of a man enduring a delay, glancing now and then at the country nurse and the brass compass with the faint amusement of a tourist. They were all of them good, in their way, and the story is not interested in making fools of them, only in showing the gap between what they knew and what was about to be asked of them. Hale knew more about the inside of a damaged human body than anyone for 200 miles. Cole and Priya knew their algorithms cold, but none of the three of them had ever stood in front of more catastrophe than the building could hold and decided, in the space of seconds and without help, who lived. They did not know that this was a different skill entirely, that it could not be reasoned out from first principles in the moment, that it had to already be in the hands and the spine before the moment arrived, drilled in until it ran without the conscious mind, the way Ruth had drilled it into hers in the empty ambulance bay on 100 slow nights, while they would have laughed at her from the doorway. They thought, the way the confident and the credentialed think, that being good at medicine would be enough. They were about to find out that being good at ordinary medicine is never enough. Not for this, that for this you need something older and quieter and far more expensive, paid for in a currency none of them had ever been asked to spend. At 11 minutes past 7, 2 miles up the mountain, inside the long highway tunnel that bored through the ridge above the valley, the whiteout reached all the way into the tunnel mouth, and a truck coming down too fast for the ice on the painted lane lost its trailer, and the trailer came across the lanes, and in the dark throat of that tunnel, where the snow had turned the entrance to a blind wall of white, car after car after car came into it at speed and could not stop. Inside the little emergency room, at first, nothing happened at all. That is the part people never understand about a disaster, that it does not announce itself to the people who are about to be buried in it. There was only, a moment later, a single short tone from the radio at the nurse's station, the county channel, a clipped flat voice that most of the staff did not even register over the hum, requesting any available units to a reported multi-vehicle collision in the Ridge Tunnel, multiple casualties, access compromised by weather. Cole heard it and did not look up from his chart. Priya heard it and thought, vaguely, that it sounded like a job for the county crews and the trauma center down the mountain, the way you think a fire across the valley is someone else's fire. Hale heard the words multiple casualties and assumed, the way his whole career in a big trauma system had taught him to assume, that the wounded would be triaged at the scene and driven to a proper trauma center, and that some small manageable number might eventually trickle to this little door. Not one of them understood, in that first quiet minute, what the words multiple casualties in the Ridge Tunnel actually meant when the pass was closed and the snow was falling 4 inches an hour, and the only lit doors within 40 miles belonged to a 6-bed hospital at the head of the valley. Not one of them understood that the system they were trusting to protect them was, at that exact moment, snowed in, grounded, and an entire mountain away. Ruth understood. Ruth had gone completely still at the front desk the instant the tone sounded. The pen stopped over the card, her head turned a half-degree toward the radio, and something went quiet behind her eyes that Sam, glancing over, recognized at once and felt the bottom drop out of his stomach to see. Ruth had heard that flat dispatch tone say those exact kinds of words on 3 continents, and she knew, the way you know the weather is about to break, because you can feel it in your teeth. Precisely what was coming, and precisely how little time they had before it arrived. She did the arithmetic in under a second. The brutal arithmetic she had hoped she would never do again. A tunnel full of cars, the pass closed behind it, no helicopter flying in this, none flying out, not until the storm broke. The trauma center 90 minutes away on a road that no longer existed. The county's 2 ambulances and a handful of volunteer crews who would drive the only direction the snow would let them, downhill toward the one set of lit doors, hers. The walking and the freezing would come first, and the ambulances with the truly dying right behind them, and there were going to be more patients through these doors in the next 2 hours than this hospital saw in a season, and the people staffing it did not yet know they were already losing. She set the pen down. She closed her hand around the worn brass compass on her lanyard once, the way another person might cross themselves, and felt the small, familiar weight of the needle swinging to its steady north under her thumb, and she breathed out, slow, and set the fear down where she had learned to set it. If you've made it this far into Ruth's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Because up to now you have seen a competent woman swallow insult after insult and keep her dignity, and that is something, but it is not yet the thing. The thing is what happens in the next 10 minutes. When the doors of that quiet little hospital blow open and the wounded come through faster than anyone can count, and a brilliant city surgeon and 2 confident young clinicians who have spent the whole evening certain of everything discover that all of it, the titles and the trauma fellowships and the famous hands, has abandoned them at once. And the only person in the room who knows what to do is the country nurse the surgeon wrote off for carrying a compass. There is no way you walk away from this story once you have seen what she does when the wounded start to arrive. The first one came through the doors a few minutes later on his own 2 feet and he set the tone for everything after. He was a man in his 40s in a torn winter coat, one side of his face sheeted in blood from a scalp wound gone scarlet against the cold, holding his own arm at an angle arms do not go. Snow still caked white on his shoulders, and he was not screaming, he was talking, fast and bright and wrong, asking if someone could call his daughter. The particular cheerful disassociation of a man whose mind has not yet caught up with what has happened to his body. Behind him, through the snow-blasted glass, headlights swung as the first vehicles came skidding into the lot, and behind the man, on foot, came the others, 2 and then 5 and then a dozen, limping and staggering and carried and led, a torn, ragged tide of people in winter coats and work clothes with the smoke of the tunnel still gray on them and the cold already in their bones, and the small, bright waiting room filled, in the space of 90 seconds, with more blood and noise and raw human fear than it had held in the entire 6 years Ruth had worked there. A woman was screaming a name over and over. Someone was down near the doors and not moving. The man with the torn coat sat down suddenly in the middle of the floor, still asking about his daughter, and his bright, wrong talking began to slow, and his lips, Ruth saw from across the room, were going the dusky color that means a person is not moving enough air. And the little hospital froze, not from cowardice, from the simple human fact that nothing in their experience had prepared them for the shape of it, for the all-at-onceness, for the way a true surge does not arrive as a series of patients, but as a single, overwhelming wall. Cole came around the corner and stopped dead, a chart still in his hand, his face going pale and slack as his mind tried and failed to find the algorithm for this. Because there is no algorithm for this on the screen assumes one patient and infinite resources, and what stood in front of him was infinite patience and almost no resources at all. Priya went to the nearest person, the man bleeding from the scalp on the floor, and knelt and started doing exactly what she had been trained to do, a careful, thorough assessment, talking to him gently, and it would have been good care in any other circumstance, and was, at that moment, precisely the wrong thing, because while she gave one talking man her complete attention, 3 people she had not yet looked at were dying quietly along the cold wall, and she did not know to move past him, because no one had ever taught her that moving past was the job. And Hale, the best hands for 200 miles, came up out of his chair and took in the room and felt, for the first time in 25 years, the specific ground-tilting vertigo of a man whose entire expertise has just become irrelevant, because his expertise was the deep methodical repair of one badly injured person at a time in a controlled room with a full team, and what stood in front of him was not one person, and there was no team and no controlled room, only a snowbound waiting area, filling with the dying and 6 beds and a country nurse, and he opened his mouth to give an order and found he did not have one, and he heard his own voice come out higher than he meant it to, calling for a trauma bay that did not exist here, calling for a team that was not coming, and every person in earshot heard the famous man's voice climb, and the fear in the room doubled, because a frightened crowd takes its temperature from the loudest authority, and the loudest authority was coming apart. And into the center of that, while the surgeon's voice climbed and the young ones knelt over the wrong patients, walked the country nurse, and she was not frozen at all. What the room saw in the seconds after, it would spend the rest of their careers remembering. Ruth Calloway stepped up onto a chair at the front of the waiting room, and she used the first tool she had ever been given, the only one that works before any other, her own voice, raising it, but not in panic, in a flat, enormous command that cut clean through the screaming and stopped it. 3 words. The same 3 words she had used in the back of a roaring aircraft over places these people would never see. Listen to me. And something in the trained absolute certainty of it, the complete absence of fear in a room drowning in fear, made every face turn toward her, the wounded and the staff and the surgeon all at once, the way people in a falling building turn toward the one calm voice. "If you can hear me, and you can walk," she said, into the silence she had made, "stand up and walk through that door on the left, and someone will meet you with a blanket and get your name. You go now, you keep yourself warm, and you have already done the hardest part." And it was not cruelty, it was the opposite of cruelty, the first act of someone who knew that the only way to find the dying was to clear away everyone who was not, and a third of the room, the walking wounded, the bright talking ones, rose and moved toward the door, and in 10 seconds the chaos thinned by a third, and the truly broken were suddenly visible against the cold floor, and Ruth was already stepping down off the chair and moving toward the first of them, reading the room not with her heart, which wanted to go to the loudest, but with the cold drilled part of her that went straight to the quiet. The first person she reached was a young woman slumped against the base of the wall, conscious, gray, one trouser leg dark and glistening, and a spreading stain beneath her on the floor that told Ruth everything before she even knelt. A major bleed, an artery, the kind of wound that empties a person in minutes and that no amount of careful assessment will help if the assessment comes before the bleeding stops. Cole had drifted over, drawn by the obvious severity, already reaching for a supply cart, already starting the right and far too slow process of finding the things the system told him to find. And Ruth did not wait for any of it. She had a folded triangular bandage out of her own hip pocket and a windlass made of a heavy marker in her hand before Cole had the cart open, and she dropped to her knees in the spreading dark and bound it high and hard around the young woman's thigh above the wound and twisted the windlass down with a strength that does not look like much until you see it stop ephemeral bleed. Hard enough that the young woman cried out, and the glistening pump of red from the legs stopped, simply stopped, in the time it took Cole to turn around with an unopened package in his hand. "Mark the time on her, she's a red, she goes to bay too," Ruth said to him, flat and even, not unkind, arterial thigh, the tourniquet's tight, do not loosen it for anyone, go. And Cole, who outranked her on paper and had a famous surgeon's example fresh in his mind, looked at the stopped bleeding and the woman who had done in seconds what he had been 3 minutes from doing, and some part of his borrowed certainty cracked clean across, and he did the smartest thing he would do all night. He stopped arguing with the universe about what was supposed to be happening, and he did what she said. That was the hinge of it, the moment the night turned, though no one had time to notice it as it happened. Because Cole moved, and the moving worked, and the woman lived, the rest of them began, one by one, to orient on the only fixed point in the room. The calm woman in navy scrubs kneeling in the blood who clearly, unmistakably, knew exactly what she was doing. Ruth did not ask for command. Command simply flowed to the competence the way water finds the low ground, and she took it without a flicker of hesitation, because she had held it before in far worse places. She came up off her knees and began, in a voice that carried without shouting, to build a machine out of the frightened people around her. She put Sam at the doors as the sorting point, the single funnel every new patient would pass through. Because Sam could read people and would not freeze, she sent Priya, pulled gently but firmly off the one talking man she had been tending, to run the red zone with a 2-sentence briefing that was worth more than a year of lectures, stop the bleeding you can see, open the airways that are closed, and do nothing else. Do not assess, do not chart, just keep them alive until we can come back. And then she turned to Hale. This was the part that took a particular kind of nerve, because Hale was one of the finest surgeons in the state, standing in the middle of her waiting room with his expertise turned to water, and a lesser person who needed the credit might have left him to flounder, might have taken a quiet satisfaction in the famous man's helplessness. Ruth did the opposite. She walked up to him and spoke low and fast and level, not as a nurse to a doctor, and not as a rescuer to a man who was drowning, but as one professional handing another the one job that would save him. And she said, "Doctor, I need you to stop trying to run this floor, because you've never run one like this and it'll eat you alive. And I have. What I need from you is the thing nobody else in this building can do. I need you in the back, in the 2 beds we can turn into a surgical space, doing the deep saves, the bellies, and the chests, the ones that need real hands, and I will feed you exactly the patients who need exactly that, one at a time, so you never have to choose. You do what you're the best in the world at, and let me do what I'm good at, and between us we keep more of these people than anybody has a right to. Can you do that?" And Hale, his face a war between affront and the dawning animal understanding that he was lost and she was not, looked at this country nurse he had mocked 4 hours earlier, and something in him, some deep surgeon's honesty that had survived under all the pride, recognized the truth of every word, and he said, "Yes, yes, I can do that. Feed me." And he went. And then Ruth Calloway stood at the center of her overwhelmed little hospital, in the spreading noise of the worst night of its history, and she did the thing she had been built for in the years no one here knew about. She ran the triage. She walked the growing rows of the wounded at a pace that looked almost unhurried and was in fact ruthlessly fast, and she sorted them, laying a hand on each, reading each in the 2 or 3 seconds each one could be given, and she spoke a single color over each that sent them flowing to the right place, red for the ones who would die without immediate intervention, but could be saved. The arterial bleeds in the closing airways and the chests that could not move air, yellow for the serious but stable, the broken bones and the deep lacerations that could wait their turn, green for the walking wounded already filing into the side room with their blankets, and twice in that first hour, with a stillness in her that the staff would never forget and never quite forgive, the necessity of, the quiet word that meant there was nothing to be done, the patients too far gone to save with what they had on a snowed-in mountain with no surgeon to spare and no flight coming, who could only be made warm and not alone while the ones who could be saved were saved first. She did not flinch from those 2. That was the cost she had paid for long ago and carried in the coin on her lanyard, the terrible knowledge that triage is not about saving everyone, because everyone cannot be saved. It is about saving the most, and that the person willing to make that arithmetic out loud, in the open while everyone else looks away from it, is the most important and the loneliest person in the room. The second wave hit at 29 minutes past 7, and it was worse than the first, because the first had been the walking and the lightly hurt, and the second was what the ambulances brought down the mountain on their later runs, the ones who could not walk. The crushed and the broken pried out of folded cars in the dark of the tunnel. And they came through the bay doors on backboards and in the arms of half-frozen strangers with a thing layered over every single injury that Ruth had been bracing for since the first tone, which was the cold. That was the part this storm added that the city would never have had to fight. The part Hale had not even thought to be afraid of yet. Every one of them had been bleeding in a tunnel in a 4-inch-an-hour blizzard, and the cold was in all of them, dropping their core temperatures, thinning their blood so it would not clot, slowing their hearts toward rhythms that would not come back, and Ruth knew that on this mountain the cold would try to kill as many of them as the wreck had, and that nobody else in the building had ever once had to factor a freezing patient into a bleeding one. She had. She had done exactly this on a frozen ridge on the far side of the world, and she folded that knowledge into her sorting without breaking stride, adding a fourth question to the three she asked of every body she knelt over. Not just are they bleeding and are they breathing and is their heart holding, but how cold are they? How long were they down in it? How much time does the cold leave me before the rest of it stops mattering? She met the first backboard at the doors beside Sam and read the patient in a glance. A young man, his chest crushed against something in the wreck, struggling for each breath, his neck veins standing out like cords, his lips the dusky blue that was half the cold and half the thing happening inside him, and she knew this one cold. A tension building in the chest cavity that would kill him in another minute or two, and she knew the fix for it lived in this little hospital, behind a wall of permissions and a procedure tray nobody had time to find. She did not hesitate. She called for Hale as she moved, "I need you now, tension pneumo, Bay 1, and she had the young man's coat open and her cold fingers counting down his ribs by the time Hale came through from the back, and what happened next was the first moment the visiting surgeon truly saw her. Because she did not hand him a frightened patient and a problem, she handed him a patient already prepped. The landmark found, her finger pressed on the exact spot, and she said, fast and flat, the precise place and depth, the way a scrub nurse who has done it 1,000 times feeds a surgeon, and Hale, running on pure instinct now, did the decompression, and the trapped air hissed out and the young man's chest filled, and his color came back from the dead gray edge. And Hale looked up at the country nurse with an expression that had no name, because the thing he was beginning to feel did not fit anywhere in the file he had built on her. "Where did you learn that?" he said. Not a challenge now, a real question, almost lost in the noise. And Ruth was already turning to the next backboard, and she said over her shoulder, later, "Get him to the back and watch his temperature. He's been in the cold too long." And she was gone into the flood, and Hale stood for 1/2 second looking after her before the next dying patient pulled him back under, and the question stayed in him. A small stone dropped into a deep well, falling. It went on like that for what the clock would later say was a little under 4 hours, and what felt to everyone inside it like both a single held breath and an entire winter. And the building, which had been built and stocked for a quiet valley where the worst Tuesday brought a broken wrist, began, one supply at a time, to run dry, and she did not panic when the shelves emptied, because she had simply never expected them to be full. They ran out of the manufactured trauma dressings within the first half hour, and Ruth, without breaking stride, began improvising hemorrhage control the way she had in places that had no shelves at all, folded triangular bandages wound tight around a windlass made of a marker or a pair of bandage scissors. And she pulled 2 terrified volunteers out of the green room, a snowplow driver with steady hands and a school teacher who had walked in with a cut on her head and refused to sit down, and taught each of them in 15 seconds how to twist and tie and hold. When the warmed blankets ran out, and they ran out fast, Ruth turned the building itself into a rewarming machine the way she had once turned a freezing cargo bay into one, sending Priya to strip every sheet and curtain from the empty beds, running bags of saline under the hot tap until they were warm and packing them into the armpits and groins of the coldest patients, moving the worst of the hypothermic ones into the furnace room off the back hallway where the old boiler made the air thick and close, because warm was a treatment here as surely as any drug, and she knew, the way the others did not, that a cold patient who is bleeding cannot be saved by stopping the bleeding alone, that you fight both fires at once or lose them to the one you forgot. The blood bank, a single small refrigerator with a modest store, could not begin to keep up, and Ruth ran the cooler herself, allocating the units not to the ones who needed them most, which is what an untrained heart does, but to the ones the blood would actually save, which is not always the same patient. And then, in the second hour, the thing she had asked about on a regional call once and been laughed at for finally happened. The snow load brought down a line up the valley, and the lights stuttered and dropped for 3 long seconds into pitch black before the old generator coughed and caught and brought them up to the dim red half-light of emergency power, half the outlets dead. The bright modern hospital reduced in an instant to a dim cave full of the dying, and in those 3 seconds of total dark, while everyone else froze and someone screamed, Ruth Calloway did not so much as pause. Because she had done all of this in the dark before, had managed airways by feel in a blacked-out aircraft with the engines screaming, and her voice simply came through the blackness, steady and unhurried, telling the room to hold still and breathe, telling Sam to find the headlamps in the disaster cart she had stalked herself against the very day an administrator would write her up for it. And when the dim light came up, the staff found her exactly where her voice had been, kneeling over a patient with her hands already working, a fixed point you could navigate by, the way frightened people in the dark navigate by the one voice that is not afraid. The world, of course, did not stop sending its ordinary emergencies just because a tunnel had filled with cars, and somewhere in the second hour the test got harder in a way no protocol accounts for. A pickup came sliding into the lot, nothing to do with the wreck, just the random cruelty of timing, and a man half carried his mother through the doors. An older woman in her 70s whose face had gone slack down one side and whose words had turned to a slurred ruin, a stroke in full progress, arriving into the middle of a disaster that had already consumed every resource the building had. The son was frantic, shouting that his mother was dying, and he was right. On any ordinary Tuesday, 4 people would have descended on her at once. But this was not an ordinary Tuesday, and Ruth had to hold in 3 seconds the 2 truths that do not want to be held together: that this woman's life mattered exactly as much as every torn body on her floor, and that the building did not have enough hands to give her everything she needed without letting someone else die in the next room. She did not freeze, and she did not lie. She got the woman onto the one free monitor, noted the time the trouble had started, did the few fast things that could be done, and folded her into the flow as a case that would have to wait its turn, and she did it so cleanly that neither the woman nor her son ever understood how thin the margin had been. And the son she handled the way she had handled 100 frantic relatives at the edges of catastrophes all over the world, not by ordering him away, which never works, but by giving him a job, telling him his mother needed him to hold her good hand and keep talking to her, low and calm, keep her warm with his own coat, and keep her from being frightened, and the man, drowning in his helplessness, seized the job the way a drowning man seizes a rope, and sat, and stopped being a danger and started being a comfort, and the small chaos he had been making simply dissolved into the larger order she was building. And the staff changed as the night ground on, the way people always change under someone who knows what they are doing. The fear that had doubled when Hale's voice climbed had been replaced, gradually, by something Ruth had watched take hold before in desperate places: a grim, competent calm that flows downhill from a calm commander, and the bright young clinicians who had frozen 90 minutes earlier were now moving with a hard new purpose, doing more and better work than they had ever done in their lives, because she had freed them from the impossible weight of deciding everything and given them each one clear job and the steadying knowledge that someone above them was holding the whole. Cole ran the surgical feed she had built him, ferrying the deep saves to Hale one at a time. Priya ran her red zone and did not once drift back to giving one stable patient her whole attention, because she had learned in a single night to move past the loud to reach the silent. And the three of them, who had spent 4 winters thinking of Ruth as the quiet woman who handed out blankets, understood now, without anyone saying it, that they had been working alongside someone they had never once actually seen. There was a fresh wave of friction in the middle of all this, the kind that always comes when more than one authority arrives at a disaster, in the shape of a state trooper who had fought his way up the valley behind a plow, a big, competent man with the habit of command worn into him, who came through the doors meaning to take control of the scene the way he took control of every scene, asking loudly where the doctor was and that nobody was to move patients without his say. And Ruth, without stopping the thing her hands were doing, met his eye and spoke to him in a voice that he of all people recognized at once, the flat level certainty of someone who has run worse than this, and she said, "Trooper, I'm running it, and I need you on the road, not in this room. Keep the lane open so the trucks can keep bringing me the wounded, and so the minute this storm breaks enough to fly, the helicopter has somewhere to land. That's the job that saves the most people right now, and you're the only one who can do it." And the trooper, who knew that voice in his bones because it was the voice he used on his own worst nights, said, "Yes, ma'am," and went back out into the storm to do exactly what she had asked. Garrett Voss arrived a little after that. He had been called the way administrators are called when a disaster becomes a thing that will have to be explained later, and he had come up the mountain behind the same plow, in his good wool coat and his city shoes carrying nothing useful, and he stopped, as everyone stopped, at the sheer overwhelming sight of it, the bloodied corridors, the improvised tourniquets twisted onto leg after leg, the dim red emergency light, the patients packed warm with linen and warmed saline in every bed and on the floor between them, the controlled, desperate motion of a 6-bed hospital that had taken a 100-car catastrophe and was, against every reasonable expectation, holding, and then his eyes found the center of it, and he saw, to his visible confusion, that the person directing his department, the person every clinician and volunteer was orienting on and obeying, the person the state trooper had just taken an order from and gone back out to follow, was the country charge nurse he had written up the week before for operating outside her scope, the one with the unauthorized drills and the compass not approved by the supply committee. For a moment, the disaster and the chain of command collided in his mind, and the chain of command won, because it always had, because the columns were the whole of his religion, and he crossed the floor to her with a tight official expression and said, in the low, controlled voice of a man already thinking about liability, "Ruth, Ruth, you can't be running clinical operations. This has to be physician-led. Where is Dr. Hale? You are not authorized to make these." And he got that far before something happened that he did not expect. Hale cut him off. Hale, who had spent the first half of that evening agreeing with every unspoken judgment Garrett Voss had ever made about the country nurse, who had mocked her compass and called her a quaint local fixture, looked up from the back where he was elbow deep in keeping a man alive, his borrowed gown soaked through, his pride long since burned away and replaced by something cleaner and harder. And he said, loud enough to carry over the whole room, "She is authorized. I'm authorizing her. She has command of this floor and has had it since the doors opened, and she is the only reason any of these people are still breathing. Anybody who has a problem with that can take it up with me in writing when we are not drowning." And he went back to his patient. And Garrett Voss stood there with his scope of practice memo somewhere in a drawer 300 miles away, in a room that had just, with 2 sentences from the most credentialed man in the building, rendered all of it meaningless, and for the first time in the entire story he had nothing to say, because the numbers he ran the world by had no column for what was happening in front of him. And somewhere underneath the affront a far more uncomfortable feeling was beginning to stir, which was the dawning suspicion that he had spent the better part of a year quietly building a file on the single most valuable person in his entire network. The question everyone in the building had begun, without quite knowing it to ask, got spoken out loud at last by one of the volunteer ambulance crew, a grizzled old hand named Webb who had pulled people out of wrecks in this valley for 30 years. He came in with another backboard and stopped on his way back out into the snow and watched Ruth reduce a dislocated shoulder and seal a chest wound and call a color over a third patient in the time it took him to set his stretcher down. And he said to Sam, not quite quietly enough, "Who is she? Where does a country charge nurse learn to run a mass cast like that? I've worked wrecks on this mountain for 30 years, and I've seen maybe 2 people move the way she's moving. And they weren't nurses, they were." And he stopped because Ruth had glanced at him, just once, a flat, steady look, and he was a man who knew that look, had seen it on the faces of the 2 people he'd been about to name, and he understood that he had wandered up to the edge of something she did not talk about, and he closed his mouth and gave her a small nod and went back out into the white. But the question hung in the air now, where the whole room could feel it. How does a country nurse know how to do that? And the building, working all around her, began to wait for the answer the way you wait for a held note to finally resolve. The trapped man came in just after that, and he was the one who would, without ever meaning to, pull the whole truth out into the light. The fire company had been cutting people out of the wreck for hours, and the worst of them came last, and this one came in still partly attached to a section of the car he had been driving, a young man in his late 20s, his leg crushed beneath a collapsed slab of frame that the crews had cut away from the rest of the wreck, with him still in it, because they could not free the leg at the scene. Without losing him to the bleeding, he was pale and shocky and gone gray with cold and blood loss together, his leg a ruin, and he was conscious, and he was terrified, and the problem he presented was the single hardest of the whole night, because the crushed and trapped limb was at once the only thing keeping him from bleeding to death, and the thing that was poisoning his blood and would stop his heart the moment the weight came. Off, a V's with no good way out of it, the grim, impossible field problem that Ruth Calloway had faced in her whole life exactly once before, in the cargo bay of an aircraft over a country she did not name, on the night that had given her the coin. She knelt by the trapped young man and did not let her face show any of it. The recognition, the old grief that rose up in her like cold water filling a flooded compartment, and she took his cold hand in hers and told him her name, which she almost never did, and told him he was going to feel her do things that hurt, and that every one of them was a thing that would get him home, and she went to work. And while her hands did the work, fast and exact, setting the lines, pushing the warmed fluids, getting ahead of the flood of poison that would surge through his system the instant the weight lifted off the leg, getting the calcium and the bicarbonate and the blood ready for the heart she knew would stop if she got the sequence even slightly wrong, the part of her mind that was not needed for the work went, the way it always did, to Eli. Eli Brandt had been her crew chief and her partner across the last 4 of her flying years, a big, calm, unhurried man a decade older than her, who had taught her almost everything she knew that no book had ever held, and the two of them had flown the dying out of the worst places on earth together 100 times, each more than once holding the other's life in their hands at altitude in the dark. It was Eli who had taught her to move past the loud to reach the silent, that the calm is a gift you give the people around you, and you get to choose which one you spread through a room. It was Eli who, on the night an aircraft went down hard on a frozen ridge, and the survivors were pinned exactly the way this young commuter was pinned now, the same the same impossible arithmetic, had climbed into the broken fuselage beside her and done with her the slow, terrible sequence thing that brings a crushed man back from the dead the moment the weight comes off, and the man had lived, and the two of them had come out into a gray, frozen dawn, filthy and shaking and alive, and Eli had pressed a small, dull challenge coin into her hand, one of his own, worn smooth, and told her to keep it, that people who do what they had just done do not get parades, they get to go home, and the coin is so you remember the ones who did not. And he had unclipped the brass compass from his own kit, the one his father had carried, and pressed that into her hand too, and told her that on the worst nights, when the dark and the dying had her so turned around that she did not know which way was home, the needle would always know, and all she ever had to do was point herself the way it pointed, and take the next step, and then the next one, and that was the whole of it. That was how you got out of anywhere alive. 11 weeks after that, on an ordinary flight on an ordinary day, in the stupid, random way the world takes its best people, Eli Brandt had not gotten to go home, and Ruth had carried the coin and the compass every single day since, through the leaving of the flights and the long, quiet years at the head of a snowbound valley, a man's whole legacy worn smooth against her chest, and she had never once told a soul at the hospital that the trinket the surgeon mocked and the administrator wrote her up for was the only grave she had. He had left her a letter, too. She had not been there when he died, and afterward someone had handed her an envelope with her name on it in his blunt, careful hand. The kind of letter the people in that work sometimes write and leave with their things against the day the random morning comes, and she had carried that folded letter in the inside pocket of every jacket she had owned since. Soft now, and worn nearly through at the creases, and she had read it so many times that she did not need to unfold it to hear it. It was short. It was not sentimental, because he had not been. It said that if she was reading it, then it had happened, and that she was not to carry it, the weight of the ones they could not save, because she had carried more than her share and saved more lives than anyone would ever write down. It said that the work was never the parades, that the work was the next person, always and only the next person, the one in front of you right now who could still be saved. And it ended with the line she heard now, kneeling on the cold floor of her own little hospital with her hands inside the worst night of a stranger's life, the line about the compass, that the needle always knows which way is home even when you have lost it completely, that all you ever have to do is point yourself at the next one who can still be saved and take the next necessary step, and then the one after that, and that is the whole of it. That is how you carry it, one necessary thing at a time until the sun comes up. She breathed out. She did the next necessary thing, and then the one after that. She got him out. When the word came that the crews had finally stabilized the cut section of wreck enough to lift it clear, she had the young man so completely prepared, every line running, every drug drawn up in order on the tray beside her knee. The improvised tourniquet she had, wound high on the thigh, ready to be cinched the instant the weight came off, that when the slab finally rose and the ruined leg came free, and his heart did exactly what she had known for an hour it would do, and stopped. She was already pushing the calcium and the bicarb, and calling the compressions in the same flat, calm voice. And a minute and a half later, while a young volunteer wept with a relief he could not yet afford, the young man's heart stuttered and caught and held. And he was alive, and he would stay alive, because the woman the network had decided was just a country nurse had once climbed into a broken aircraft on a frozen ridge beside a man who was gone now, and learned, in the worst place on earth, the exact and terrible sequence that brings this one back. Not everyone came back. That has to be said, because the story would be a lie without it. There was a woman in the red zone, perhaps 50, whose bleeding they had controlled in the first hour and whose color had been climbing back toward life, and who crashed without warning in the third hour from an injury hidden deep inside her that no one could have seen in time. Not with one tired old imaging machine and no surgeon to spare and no flight in the air. And Ruth was at her side within seconds and ran the code herself, hard and expert and complete, every right thing in the right order for the better part of 40 minutes, far longer than she should have, and the woman died anyway, past the reach of any hands on earth. And for just one moment, when she finally called it and said the time of death in the flat, steady voice and stepped back from the bed, the staff saw the true cost of what she was, saw it cross her face and go quiet behind her eyes, the particular private grief of the person who carries the arithmetic for everyone else, and then they saw her do the single hardest thing any of them had ever watched a human being do, which was to set it down deliberately the way you set down a tool you cannot use right now, and turn and walk to the next patient, because the next patient could still be saved and the woman on the bed could not. She did the next necessary thing. The young volunteer who had wept earlier watched her do it and understood at last what the job actually was and what it cost and what it meant that this woman had been doing it quietly at their front desk for 6 winters while the valley called her the burned-out small-town lifer. By the 4th hour, the wave had crested. The crews up at the tunnel had cut free the last of the trapped. The trucks were coming down the mountain empty now, and the great choking flood of the wounded had become, gradually, a finite number of human beings sorted and stabilized and being worked, methodically, by a building that had been turned, in the space of a single storm, from a frightened handful of people into one of the finest trauma teams that had ever existed inside those walls, and the thing that had turned it stood at the center of the dim red room in navy scrubs, gone black with other people's blood. Still steady, still calling the next necessary thing. The count, when they finally had time to make it, was almost impossible to believe. 103 patients through the doors of a 6-bed hospital in a little under 4 hours, the kind of surge that closes departments 10 times the size. And in this one, which should by every reasonable expectation have been buried into chaos and loss. The survival numbers were going to come out when the long reviews were finally done, almost impossibly good in a way the experts who studied it afterward would struggle to explain without using the word the hospital's own records did not contain, which was that, on the night the tunnel came down in the storm, this little building had, by pure accident, been run by one of the finest mass casualty triage officers alive. And then, a little before dawn, the storm broke. It did not break gently. The winds simply fell off all at once the way mountain storms do when they have spent themselves, and the snow thinned to a few last drifting flakes, and a hard cold clarity came down over the valley and into the new stillness, faint at first and then growing. Came a sound that Ruth Calloway heard before anyone else in the building did, because it was a sound her body had been built around for 11 years, The deep, rhythmic beat of rotor blades coming up the valley, an aeromedical helicopter finally able to fly, coming for the criticals at last. The trooper had kept the lane open and the lot cleared exactly as she had asked, and the aircraft came down out of the gray first light onto the snow-packed ground at the edge of the lot, and the doors slid open, and the flight crew came across the snow toward the little hospital in their heavy flight suits, moving with the particular economical urgency of people who do this for a living. The man who came through the doors first and stopped was the senior of the crew, the flight officer running the medevac, a weather-beaten man in his 50s, gray at the temples, calm in the specific bone-deep way that only people who have done this kind of work for 30 years are calm, and he came in out of the cold dawn and stopped, as everyone that night had stopped, at the sheer, overwhelming sight of it, the bloodied corridors, the color-coded zones still holding clean in the dim light, the 103 lives sorted and stabilized and waiting, the improvised tourniquets done a particular correct way, the order under the exhaustion. And he stood there with the eye of a man who has seen a great many disaster receptions and knows in an instant the difference between one that was survived and one that was run. And what he saw made his eyebrows go up, because most of them were a mess, and this one, for all the blood and the weariness, bore the unmistakable fingerprints of someone who had run it by a doctrine he recognized in his own spine. He saw the casualty flow, the way the cold had been fought alongside the wounds, the warmed saline, the furnace room, the things you only think to do if you have run trauma somewhere it freezes. And he began, frowning slightly, to look around the room for the person who had to be responsible, expecting some flown-in disaster specialist, and his eye traveled across the dim red room and snagged and stopped on a woman in filthy navy scrubs with a brass compass on a frayed cord around her neck. He went very still. The room, which had been a churn of exhausted motion all night, seemed to the people in it to slow around the two of them. Though nothing actually slowed, it only felt that way afterward in the telling. He took a step toward her, and another, his eyes moving over her the way a man's eyes move when he is matching a face in front of him against a face from a long time ago, from another country, from the worst and most important days of his own life. He took in the worn brass compass on the loop at her chest, the old soft brass and the small dull coin clipped beside it, and his weather-beaten face did something complicated, and when he spoke his voice was not loud, but the room had gone quiet enough by then to hear it. Every clinician and volunteer and the administrator in his good wool coat and the two young staff she had forged into a team, all of them watching this strange, slow recognition unfold without yet understanding it. "I know you," he said. And Ruth, who had not stopped working, who had a card in her hand and was already half turning toward the next thing, went still in her turn and looked at him, really looked, and the room watched something cross her own face. Recognition answering recognition across a span of years and an ocean. "I know you," the old flight officer said again, and he came the last few steps to her and he said a word that no one in that hospital had ever heard. A word that was not Ruth and was not Calloway and was not nurse. A call sign, two clipped syllables, the names she had answered to in the places she did not talk about, and he said it the way you say a name you were sure you would never get to say to its owner again. And Ruth Calloway, after a long moment, gave the smallest nod, which was its own kind of answer. "I crewed evac out of the same field your unit flew out of," the officer said, and now he was speaking half to her and half, without quite meaning to the stunned and silent room, because he was a man who understood instinctively that a wrong was being righted in front of him and that it needed witnesses. after your time, but everybody who came through there after you flew, they taught us the way you sorted a cabin. They taught the load plan you wrote on the night of the ridge. There was a crew chief, used to talk about a flight nurse who ran the worst loads anybody flew, who brought back people nobody had any business bringing back, and who'd lost, and he stopped. Because Ruth's eyes had moved, just once, to the compass on her chest and back, and the officer was a man who knew exactly what that meant, and he let the name of the dead go unsaid, the way you do. He looked around the wrecked little hospital, at the controlled aftermath of a surge that should have been a catastrophe, and he understood precisely who had done it, and he looked back at her, and the next thing he did slowly and deliberately and entirely on purpose, in front of all of them. The old flight officer came to attention, this gray, weathered man who had flown 100 disasters and bowed to no one, and he brought his hand up in a slow, precise, unmistakable salute and held it to a country-charged nurse in blood-blackened scrubs in a 6-bed mountain hospital, and said, "Quietly, ma'am, it is an honor to finally put a face to that call sign. I have been hearing about you for the better part of 15 years, and I never thought I'd get to stand in a room you'd run." And the room understood. All at once, the surgeon who had mocked her compass, and the young clinicians who had deferred past her, and the administrator who had built a file on her, every one of them understood at the same instant exactly who had been standing at their front desk for 6 winters, exactly whose hands had been on their patients all night, exactly what the trinket was that the visiting surgeon had laughed at and the policy had forbidden. The woman the network had decided was the least important person in the building was, and had been all along, the most, and not one of them, in that moment, could find a single thing to say. Ruth did not enjoy it. That is the part that mattered most about her, and it would have disappointed anyone hoping for a scene of triumph. She did not draw herself up. She did not look at Hale or at Garrett Voss or let a single flicker of vindication cross her face. She looked, for a moment, deeply and simply tired, the tiredness of someone who has carried a great weight a very long way and has just had it acknowledged and finds that the acknowledgement does not make the weight 1 ounce lighter, only a little less lonely. And then she did the only thing she knew how to do. She returned the old officer's salute with a small nod, equal to equal. That said more than any speech could have, and turned back to her building, because there were still patients who needed to fly and a long, cold morning of it ahead, and she said, in the same flat, steady voice she had used all night, "We've got 4 Reds who need to be on that aircraft in the next 20 minutes. Worst first. Let's load them right and not lose anybody on the way down the mountain." And the spell broke, and the room came back into motion, and the work went on. But it went on differently now, because everything had changed, and every soul in that building knew it. Hale found her an hour later, when the criticals were on the aircraft and the building had begun the long, slow exhale of a crisis ending. He looked older than he had the evening before, and humbler, in the way men are humbled not by being beaten, but by being shown the true size of something they had been too small to see. And he did not make excuses, which was the one decent thing left for him to do, and he did it. "I was wrong about you," he said, "from the minute I walked in, and I said things, and I want you to know that I know it." He stopped, and then he said the thing that cost him the most. "When it started, I froze. I had no idea what to do, and you knew exactly what to do, and you ran my floor and saved my patients and handed me the one job I could still be good at, and you never once made me feel it. I've been doing this 25 years, and I have never seen anything like what you did tonight." And Ruth looked at him, and there was no cruelty in her, none at all, And she said simply, "You did good work tonight. Once you had room to. That decompression saved that kid, and the belly you opened saved another one. You're a fine surgeon, Marcus." And then, because the work was always the only point, she added quietly, "If you want to thank me, help me make the next one go better. This tunnel will fill again in some other storm, and the only thing standing between these people and the dark cannot be one tired nurse who happened to be on shift. Let me run my drills on the clock with the staff so the whole valley knows what to do." And Hale, who 12 hours earlier had offered to show her how to put a compass on her phone, said, "Yes, God, yes, teach all of us. Start with me." Garrett Voss never quite apologized. Men like Garrett Voss rarely do, because the apology would require them to take apart the entire structure by which they understand their own importance. But something in him had shifted all the same, and it showed in the only language he had. The counseling notice disappeared from her file. No one ever saw him remove it, but it was simply gone, as though it had never been written. The drills were approved a few weeks later as a new network disaster preparedness initiative for the Valley's critical access sites, written up in his careful institutional language as though it had been his own idea from the start, which Ruth let him have without a flicker. Because she did not care whose idea the world believed it was. Only that the staff would be ready when the tunnel filled again. And months later, when the regional review held that small understaffed mountain hospital up as a model of mass casualty response, it was Garrett Voss who stood at the front of a bright conference room and accepted the recognition on behalf of the network, and he did not say Ruth Calloway's name. And Ruth, sitting in the back in her navy scrubs, did not mind, because she had stopped needing her name said out loud a long time ago, in a place where no names were ever said at all. The people who mattered knew. That was enough. It had always been enough. The two young ones were never the same after that night, and that, more than any salute, was the thing Ruth would have called the real reward. Cole, who had frozen with a chart in his hand, became her most relentless student, turning up for every drill, asking the questions she could see cost him his pride, and he would become a genuinely fine clinician, the kind who stays calm when the room comes apart, and he would tell the story, when he taught the ones who came after him, of the night a country nurse stepped onto a chair in a snowstorm and stopped a room full of dying people from drowning, and he would always end it the same way, by telling them that the most important person in any room is almost never the one with the most letters after their name. And Priya, who had knelt so carefully over the one talking man, while three silent people died along the wall, never again confused thoroughness for judgment, and she became the one with the real gift for triage, the one who could walk into chaos and feel her way straight to the dying, and she had learned it in a single night from the woman who had taught her, the hard way, to move past the loud to reach the silent. The young man with the crushed leg came back. It took months, and surgeries, and a long, hard road, but he kept the leg, and one afternoon the following spring, when the valley had gone green, he walked back into the little hospital on two canes and a great deal of stubbornness to find the nurse who had knelt in the wreck of his car and held his cold hand and told him every hurt was a thing that would get him home. He found her at the front desk, of course, and he did not make a speech, because she was not a woman who would have known what to do with one. He just stood there a moment and then said, "Thank you for not letting go." And Ruth, who had held the hands of more frightened people than she could count across half the world, felt something move in her that she did not let show. And she told him to sit down before he fell down, and checked his vitals out of pure habit, two steady fingers on his wrist, and told him he was healing well, and he was. He asked her before he left where she had learned to do what she did, and this time she gave him a little more of the answer than usual. She told him she had learned it in some hard, cold places from some good people, most of whom had not gotten to come home, and that bringing him home had been, in a way he would never fully understand, a way of bringing a small piece of them home too. He did not press. He was by then someone who understood that some things are carried and not explained, and he went back out into his second life, the one she had given him. Sam knew the most, in the end, and after that night the two of them never once spoke of it directly, but something settled between them that had not needed words before and needed them even less now. Sam simply started leaving a second thermos on the front desk at the start of every winter shift. Hot cocoa against the cold, the small mundane ritual of one person telling another that they are seen. And Ruth drank it, and that was the whole of the conversation, and it was complete. And the cocky traveling nurse who had once called her the burned-out small-town lifer heard the story secondhand and came back through a season later and could not quite meet her eyes and mumbled that he was sorry, that he hadn't known, and Ruth told him what she always told the ones who had underestimated her and lived to learn better, that it was all right, that nobody ever knows what anybody else has carried, and that the only thing that matters is what you do the next time you are wrong about someone. It is worth asking, before the story closes, why a person like Ruth Calloway chooses the quiet at all, why someone who had flown the worst loads on earth would instead take the most invisible job in the highest valley and let a man like Garrett Voss build a file on her for a year without once setting him straight. The easy answer, the wrong one, is that she was broken, that the flights had hollowed her out, and the front desk was where the hollow people go to hide. But that was not it. And Sam, who watched her closest, knew it was not it. Ruth had spent 11 years where every day was the worst day of someone's life, and she had learned out there exactly what she was capable of and exactly what it cost. And she had decided, when she came down off the mountains of the world with Eli's coin in her pocket and his letter folded over her heart, that she did not need the world to keep telling her she was extraordinary. She knew what she was. She had nothing left to prove to anyone, which is the rarest and most dangerous kind of freedom a person can have, because it cannot be taken and it cannot be bought, and it makes you serenely unbothered by the Hales and the Vosses of the world, who run on exactly the opposite fuel, on the endless need to be told that they matter. She had chosen the front desk because the work was honest and the need was real, and every shift somebody frightened and cold came in out of the storm, and she got to be the steady hand that met them, and that to her was not one step down from the flights. It was the flights, distilled to their purest form. The next necessary thing, one person at a time, no parades, no podium, just the work and the deep, quiet satisfaction of being exactly where she was needed, unseen and entirely herself. There is a thing the people who run the world by titles never understand about the people who run it by competence, and it should be said plainly before the end. The titled believe recognition is the point, that the salute and the plaque and the name said out loud are the reward the work is paid in, and so they cannot comprehend a person who does the work without needing the pay. And they mistake that person's silence for the silence of someone with nothing to say, when it is, in fact, the silence of someone who already holds everything that matters. The systems we build to sort the important from the unimportant, the letters after the name, the title on the coat, the equipment approved by the supply committee, are useful most of the time, on the ordinary Tuesdays when the patients come in one at a time. But they are only a map of the truth, and like every map they are wrong in exactly the places that matter most. And the night the tunnel comes down in the storm, The night the wave arrives that the systems were never built to hold, the map fails, and all that is left is the territory. And in the territory, the only thing that has ever mattered is whether the person in front of you knows what to do, whether they will keep their head when everyone else loses theirs, whether they will move past the loud to reach the silent and make the terrible arithmetic out loud and hold the line until the sun comes up over the ridge. Titles cannot do that. Only people can do that. And the people who can are almost never the people the room has decided to look at. A few weeks after the night of the tunnel, on an ordinary evening before an ordinary shift, Ruth Calloway sat alone for a while in the quiet of the empty break room as the last of the day's cold gold light came slanting low through the window and lay across the table. She had a soft cloth in her hands and the worn brass compass on the table in front of her, off her lanyard for once, and she was cleaning it slowly, the way she did every so often, working the cloth into the seam of the case and along the band gone soft and pale from 19 years of long days, and beside it on the table sat the small dull challenge coin, and beside that, unfolded, soft and worn nearly through at the creases, sat the letter. She did not need to read it. She knew every word of it by heart. But she read it anyway, the way you visit a grave, the blunt, careful handwriting of a big, calm, unhurried man who had taught her to move past the loud to reach the silent and had not, himself, gotten to go home. The work was the next person, always and only the next person. The needle always knows which way is home, even when you have lost it completely. Point yourself at the next one who can still be saved, and take the next step, and then the one after that. And that is the whole of it. That is how you carry it, one necessary thing at a time until the sun comes up. She sat with it as the gold light faded toward dusk. 41 years old, 19 of those years spent with her hands inside other people's worst days, and she let herself feel, for a few minutes, the full weight of all of it. Eli and the coin and the frozen ridge, and the tunnel in the storm, and the woman in the red zone she had not been able to save, and the young man on 2 canes who had walked back in to say thank you for not letting go. And then, the way she had learned to, she set it down. She folded the letter along its soft creases and slid it back into the inside pocket over her heart, and picked up the small dull coin and turned it over once and clipped it back onto the faded canvas band. And then she picked up the worn brass compass, the hiking trinket, the little gadget she did not need, the only grave she had, and clipped it back onto the band beside the coin where it belonged, and watched the needle swing once and settle the way it always did, the way it always would, to its steady, patient north. And she snapped the lanyard straight and squared her shoulders and stood up, because it was almost time to open the board. And somewhere out beyond the tall glass doors, the ordinary evening of a small mountain town was already coming in, the coughs and the broken wrists and the old men who had ignored their chest pains since lunch, the gentle catalog of human trouble, and on almost every night, that was all it would ever be. But she would carry the compass anyway. She would always carry the compass, because the day she stopped carrying it would be the day she needed it, and because somewhere a man had once told her that people who do what she did do not get parades, they get to go home, and going home for Ruth Calloway had always meant going back to the desk at the front of the little building where the frightened people came in out of the cold, and being the calm in the room, unseen and steady and ready for the next one and the one after that. So here is what I will leave you with, the question I have been turning over since I first heard this story. The next time you are in a room full of credentials and confidence, full of the people the world has lifted up and the systems everyone has been taught to trust, and something begins, quietly, to go wrong, who are you going to be? Are you going to be one of the ones who keeps trusting the title and the protocol and the loudest voice in the room, right up until the moment all of it fails at once? Or are you going to be the one who looks for the quiet, competent soul at the edge of it, the steady pair of hands everyone else has written off, and asks her what she sees and learns? The way a whole building full of certain people learned on the night a tunnel came down in a blizzard that the most important person in the room is almost never the one the room has decided it is. Competence does not announce itself, and the quietest hands in the building are so often the ones holding it up. That was tonight's story from Unspoken Valor. Quiet courage, finally recognized. If this one stood you at attention, stay for the next and tell me in the comments who you would salute.